Hi, everyone. Welcome to our conversation about education today. Thanks for being here. I'm Marjorie Childress, Managing Editor at New Mexico In Depth, and I'm joined by Trip Jennings, our Executive Director, and Bryant Furlow, an independent reporter who we work with often. Later in the next 30 minutes or so, Bella Davis, a reporter with New Mexico In Depth who covers Indigenous affairs, is going to pop in and join us to talk a little bit about tribal education initiatives at the Roundhouse. And behind the scenes, we have Bettina Baca, who is kind of running the show for us. Thank you, Bettina. And so just everyone who's with us right now, please, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions or comments, or we want to hear from you, please drop them into the Q&A. We will read them out for folks and answer them to the best of our ability if they're questions. And so please do feel free to weigh in. That just helps make it much more of a conversation. And so Bella, thank you for being here. I just said you'd be here later and you just popped right in. So, so what we're going to do is talk. So these weekly conversations are oriented towards the state legislature, but we thought today we'd dwell a little bit more on some national goings on, particularly Trump's announcement that he wants to dismantle or get rid of actually the Department of Education. And so we thought we would invite Bryant to really help us understand the big picture there and what that agency does, and how it could impact New Mexico. But before we do that, let's just, generally speaking, Trip, I'm hoping you can just kick us off with some thoughts about. So last week we talked about kind of just the incredible amount of executive orders that were coming down nationally, how hard it was to keep up with all of them. Since last week, what has kind of been happening?
Um, I think after, last week, it was a day after you and I had spent all day Tuesday trying to figure out this, freeze on grants and loans. I mean, that's still out there. I mean, a judge, basically stayed that freeze on Monday. And so there's that. There's the Department of Education, what we're talking about. I think right now we're beginning to I think, the first 2 weeks were, especially the first week and a half, were just thing after thing after thing. They were like, I don't know, 80 executive orders the first day. And so it's like, it's just so much to process. And so I think now I'm beginning to personally, but also see in the news where people are beginning to go, okay, we've taken a breath. Now we kind of know what's happening. I think there's a lot of concern. Uh, Concern may be too soft of a word about Elon Musk and his team getting access to all sorts of agencies and data
Mhm.
about Americans. Um, One thing that there's also the potential closure of U.S. aid, which is perhaps the largest food assistance program, this is what I read, in the world. And Actually, there are people there are people in Africa. I just remember this. There are many. They're closing off. I think stopping some programs that actually go to treat people with AIDS.
Mhm.
And this is something that, because of my age and when I grew up, the 80s being the most, like, that was when I began to really pay attention to the world. 80s and 90s, that really kind of, I paid attention to that. So I think a lot of people are beginning to realize the contours of how much is being done through executive orders. I think also it's important for all of us to know that these are executive orders. These are not passed by Congress, which means they are actually in the U.S. code. Um, XOs, XOs short for executive orders, do give presidents, just like they give governors, power to exert some of their authority over certain things. But I think we'll see in the next few months how the courts will respond to a lot of these moves by Elon Musk and his team, closure of, all these executive orders. One thing I'm expecting to see is going to be challenges around separation of powers, constitutional challenge. But we have some lawyers among our attendees who might disagree with me, but I think there is a constitutional challenge there with some of these actions. So that's
Mhm.
kind of like just
Well,
uh,
the
thumbnail.
lawsuits are beginning, definitely. The lawsuits are already beginning,
Yeah,
so.
yeah, yeah.
Well, so part of, so, I mean, so, President Trump, when he was on the campaign trail, promised to shut down the Department of Education. And, from just going back, I've been kind of doing a lot of just kind of historical reading just to remind myself. And it's really a long been an objective of that side of the aisle. I mean, it's never been a popular agency with the Republican Party. Um, but I wanted to, so we thought we would bring Bryant in to talk to us a little bit about the Department of Education. Bryant, my understanding is that it's an agency created by Congress, but the Trump, he could actually move just functions of it into other agencies. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about, your perspective on what is easy to dismantle and what's not so easy, and then big picture, just what it does.
Yeah, sure. So the contours of this thing are not clear from the public statements that the administration has made so far. But a lot of what the Department of Education does is implementing federal laws that it would take a congressional move to change. He can't do that legally just with executive orders in several instances. So we're talking about a pretty small agency. And like you said, we've been here before. In his first term, President Trump sought significant cuts to the budget of the Department of Education, and at one point asked Congress to merge it with the Department of Labor and downsize it. And even though Republicans at the time controlled both houses of Congress, both chambers, they did not accommodate that. They made very modest cuts to the Department of Education, which might reflect how difficult it can be to cut funding for schools, across the country.
Maybe, I mean, do you have a sense of what it is about the Department of Education that Trump and other people on the Republican side of the aisle don't like? I mean, what is it that what's in their crosshairs in terms of what it does?
Yeah, I think there are at least two elements to the answer to that question, Marjorie. One is that it's a relatively small federal agency, but it does control close to $90 billion. And it's, a Washington, D.C. agency that tells local school districts how to do things. The other is it's very much wrapped up in the culture wars right now. The Department of Education oversees special education and anti-discrimination laws in the schools. So big picture, this is an agency that is responsible for giving states billions in special education funding and child nutrition programs. It's crucial for community and tribal colleges and universities, overseeing their accreditation process and administering loans and grant programs like Pell Grants for low-income students. But also, of course, and by the way, it's involved in loan forgiveness, which is another contentious policy area right now. In recent years, 6,000 New Mexicans benefited from loan forgiveness under Biden, and it's not clear it's pretty clear that program's not going to persist along.
There's a long-standing loan forgiveness program. I mean,
The public service loan forgiveness, is that what you're thinking of?
yes.
Yeah. But importantly, and I think this speaks to the culture war facet of things, the Department of Education plays a key role in civil rights enforcement, both directly and indirectly. It mandates that the Public Education Department, the State Education Department, or PED, collect educational equity data, including student discipline rates broken down by race and ethnicity and gender. That's how New Mexico in Depth and ProPublica were able to discover statewide racial disparities in student discipline, expulsion.
Can we just pause it for a second, just to make sure we understand? So it's not that we used federal data, it's that we used state data. That
That's
is.
correct. Yeah, the Department of Education both collects its own data from school districts nationwide every 2 years, but it also mandates that states collect disciplinary data from school districts quarterly, 4 times a year. And we leaned heavily on that data set, the state data set, for our analysis of Native American expulsion and school arrest rates. But the education department also oversees school compliance with the Civil Rights Act of '64 and Title IX, which prohibits discrimination based on sex, and also protects disabled students under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. That's a federal law that protects the rights of special ed students.
How do they, I mean, so how does the Department of Education actually, how does it bend states to its will? I mean, how does it make them do these things, collect the data? How does it enforce civil rights protections, all of those things?
So on the enforcement side, it can coerce, for lack of a better word, states with its power of the purse. It can withhold funding if states develop a pattern of non-compliance with the laws I mentioned. And at the district level, they can actually, its Office for Civil Rights investigates discrimination complaints against schools and school districts. And also, as I mentioned, collects federal level student discipline data from school districts every 2 years to spot educational inequities and discipline inequities. And as a matter of fact, right now, our Attorney General, our State Attorney General, Raul Torres, his office is examining Gallup-McKinley School student discipline data using those federal data reports as part of its investigation into that district's discipline practices.
Okay.
In part because the public education department at the state level has gotten a little bit wily since we reported on racial disparities in student discipline about releasing detailed, complete, unredacted discipline data to anybody, us and the AG's office. So the AG's office has turned to the federal database.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Marjorie, is this an okay time to ask Bryant a question? Because as we're talking, I'm just wondering, you mentioned Title I. Bryant, can you describe what Title I is to our listeners? And also, does free and reduced lunch programs, do they fall within the purview of the Department of Education? I don't know that. I don't know if it's Department of Agriculture or USDA, or I don't know.
Yeah, I'm a little fuzzy on free lunch programs as well. I do believe they're administered by the Department of Education. Title I, of course, is special funding, additional funding that the feds give to low-income districts to help meet the needs of their students.
And the vast majority of our districts are Title I districts, as I recall.
I was just going to say.
In New Mexico. That's why I was going to ask. Yeah. Okay.
And that also currently gives the U.S. Department of Education quite a bit of clout with the districts. That funding is crucial to low-income districts, including Gallup-McKinley.
Yeah. Thank you.
So Brian, does the Department of Education have any say over curriculum?
They offer guidance, but no, they don't. The U.S. government does not dictate curriculum. Curricula are up to the state offers guidance and has benchmarks that they have to meet in curricula, but doesn't provide the actual curricula to schools.
Okay.
So that falls largely, as does discipline policy, falls largely to districts.
What is the guidance they give? I mean, and do they have any, are there any kind of ramifications if a district doesn't follow their guidance around curriculum?
I haven't delved too deeply into curriculum questions, but I know that every few years the state does update. For example, in social studies education, what types of historical and civic facts students have to know at different grade levels.
Okay. And do you know off the top of your head what size of school districts budgets in New Mexico, or just generally? come from federal dollars? I mean, who's the main funder of education?
The main funder remains state and local taxes, but New Mexico does get around $130 million a year in Title I funding alone.
Mhm.
And that doesn't include the special education funding. I mean, U.S. Department of Education distributes, close to $13 billion in special education funding nationwide as well.
Okay. I did look up free lunches, I think are under USDA.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. Thank you. I didn't know whether it was education or Department of Agriculture. Thank you for looking it up.
So what are our, I mean, so in terms of, so let's say, it takes an act of Congress to dismantle the Department of Education. There's all of these programs that are really, we all know them. I mean, Title I, I mean, there's kind of is really important, there's all this stuff, and there's student aid. I mean, it's not just like kind of loan forgiveness programs. When someone's like in high school, they fill out their FAFSA to find out if they qualify for Pell Grants and loans. I mean, just this ubiquitous presence in people's lives. And that all falls under this congressionally mandated, program.
Right.
I mean, what are the options here for Trump? So I guess and this is what we're going to find out, but if he can't get rid of the department without an act of Congress, how easy would it be to just move all of these programs into other agencies and basically just dial down the activities of the Department of Education?
Right. So the laws, that stuff that's encoded in law, the special education law I mentioned, Title I, he can't just with the stroke of a pen get rid of that. That's Congress's job. But he could move enforcement or implementation of some of those laws into other agencies. The work done by the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights could be moved to the DOJ for enforcement. For example, it's harder to know where else, where other programs would be moved to.
I mean, the student aid, I mean, I think anyone who has ever had a loan in the modern age and internet age, they have an account.
Right.
Studentaid.gov, you can go in and just log in. I mean, there is this massive intersection with the American public, a big chunk of the American public with the actual Department of Education, even if they don't think in their minds about that. Like, there's a lot of data there that is really important for people.
One of the databases that Elon Musk's team is reportedly digging through right now is the financial aid and financial loans, student loans databases, which has some very sensitive data in them.
Right.
Yeah, so, again, the contours of exactly what this is going to look like are not entirely clear. We have a president who's testing boundaries right now, challenging constitutional norms and the Constitution itself in some cases. But I think the common wisdom is that he's not going to try to eliminate the department wholesale with the stroke of a pen. Who knows? And that he wouldn't legally, the courts would push back if he started trying to simply, tell them not to enforce laws passed by Congress.
Let me say this, and maybe you were going to answer this, Brian, but I seem to remember either the Associated Press or Washington Post story that I read that this email that went out last week about federal workers should resign and whatnot, that's interconnected with this stuff, which is they could encourage some of the people in Department of Education to leave. That seems to be where some of the action is right now, I think, versus like seeking congressional approval to get rid of the Department of Education. I think there does seem to be some of that. I don't know if you guys have read the same stories, but right?
Yeah, that's completely true. There's separately, in addition to the so-called Fork memo asking people to voluntarily resign, there have been already in the past week dozens of staff put on administrative leave at the Department of Education. I think as of Friday, it was 75 or 80 people, including folks at the Office of Civil Rights.
I think I was reading in the AP too, it was dozens of workers in the Department of Education, and it was the president of a labor union that represents a lot of folks who work in that agency, who said that it appears like most of the employees who were put on administrative leave had attended this voluntary anti-racism training maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So it seems like there's obviously still a lot of confusion, but it seems like there might be a connection there too.
Ironically, that workshop was under Trump's first administration, his first term.
And so, you know, this is interesting because perhaps, and maybe you guys know the answer here, what I keep seeing in news accounts, but also when you read the XOs, you know, it's agencies should take actions to curtail or end or whatever programs or services that you know are in opposition to some of his XOs, DEI kind of stuff. I wonder if that's what's happening here, which is these agencies are maybe laying off people in addition to the attendance to the seminar, but also that these could be viewed as flouting, you know, this administration's focus on ending, as they call it, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and services. It seems like that there's an intersection of those two things.
Yeah, it was interesting. I think in the same AP story it noted that it looks, again, there's still a lot of confusion, but it looks like a lot of the employees who were put on leave were not working on any sort of DEI initiatives. That was not in their job description. It was simply that they had attended this training, right?
They got educated. So this is actually going to be a good segue here in a second. I think we have a question, but I just to kind of, I do want to ask Brian, and you might not know the answer to this question, is all of the data that the Department of Education collects that we find so useful in our reporting, and is that congressionally mandated, or is that something that the Department of Education just does?
The oversight programs.
The programs where they mandate like the collection of school discipline data, or, you know, race and ethnicity enrollment data, or.
Yeah, those are requirements that are laid down in statute and federal law, not in regulations alone. And it's worth noting, I mean, you know, PED is obviously, whether they cut the federal education budget or they actually manage to close the department, PED is going to have to step up. The state is going to have to step up and do fund more of this on their own and do it without federal support. And PED itself, it's worth noting, is chronically understaffed. Its Accountability Bureau that oversees the Every Student Succeeds Acts, and they have a 40% vacancy rate as of last month. And their Data Reporting and Data Quality Bureau at PED is currently unstaffed. They don't have anyone in that bureau.
I almost feel like sometimes the data collection functions of some of our agencies get short shrift because there's, you know, agencies are understaffed. And I just find, you know, I mean, I think a lot of people would agree with this. Maybe if you don't, let me know why, that data collection isn't necessarily a strong suit of a lot of our state agencies. I think there's been a lot of improvement over the past, you know, five years maybe, but, you know, it's a continual struggle to get good data. So that could maybe be something that spurs people to think about. But I was curious about that. I mean, are we going to have a big gaping hole in our data collection if the federal government all of a sudden stops mandating it? So
pressure's going to be off too. The pressure is going to come off PED if the Department of Education isn't breathing down their neck. You know, given their staffing challenges, I don't know that they're going to be, you know, rigorously pursuing all of these tasks that they're forced to do currently.
Interesting. Okay. So we'll keep an eye on that for sure. And so we have a question from Diane Schmidt.
Very good question.
Or a comment, actually, it's a comment. We'll be interested to see if any state legislators will now try to hinder further efforts to implement Martinez-Yazzie lawsuit to include Native history in New Mexico education to show their loyalties. So thank you, Diane, for the comment and the kind of musing there. And just to remind everyone, Diane put her comment in the Q&A function, and you should too. Please weigh in. Trip?
Yeah, I mean, the reason it was the I always call it Yazzie Martinez, but the Martinez Yazzie thing. That's what when Diane mentioned that, that's what made me kind of go, well, very, good question, because I'm sitting here remembering the judge's ruling, Sarah Singleton's, ruling in 2018. But even more so, what was more informative was the 600 pages facts of finding from that lawsuit. And when you add up the number of students that are, you know, Spanish speaking or indigenous or low income or special education, I think it gets up to like 75% of our students here in public schools in New Mexico. So Yazzie Martinez Yazzie, that's a really big question that Diane has opened up in this discussion, because that's really interesting. What is going to, the state can decide to fund this stuff, but how will maybe shutting down or maybe curtailing funding of these kind of things from the feds, if they in fact, do fund some of this stuff, this is going to be a really long story with a long tail to kind of untangle over the next year or 2 years, I think, trying to figure out what this looks like.
It kind of gets at, and then I want to maybe bring Bella into the conversation to talk about some of the tribal education initiatives she's following. But in some ways, what this brings to mind for me, since it kind of zeroes in on Native education, is what I've been hearing a lot over the last couple of weeks is a pushback from tribes to the Trump administration to not lump them in with DEI because they're sovereign nations. That there's a distinction there between tribes and Trump's kind of DEI woke, his kind of verbiage around this stuff is that tribes are like making the case we are a distinct people. You can't boil us down to like a race or an ethnicity. We're sovereign nations. So I mean, that has been a really interesting argument that I've been seeing out there. And the relationship with tribes, I'm going to find that particularly interesting between this administration. So Bella, why don't we bring you in here? You're tracking a couple of, and we've long tracked tribal education you have for us over the recent years. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're following this year at the session?
Yeah, so one really big development already this year, we just published a story last week. The governor actually in her State of the State spoke about wanting 50 million for tribal ed. And she said also in her State of the State that she wants it to go directly to tribes. So this really gets at something that basically the tribal remedy framework is a plan that was created in the wake of Yazzie Martinez, created by tribal communities, Native education experts, and a lot of those kind of initiatives that framework proposes have been carried by Representative Derek Lenti for the past 7-8 years, I want to say. So he's some of what he's been trying to get at through legislation that he's carried is sort of challenges in the way that funding, education funding is distributed to tribes. So basically every year tribes can apply for grants that are a 1 or 2 year cycle. They can apply for that state funding. But tribal officials have kind of long raised this issue of there is, I think, has been slow processing of those funds by PED. And so tribes have had a real problem spending all of that funding before the grant cycle runs out. So that's made it hard for them to develop, long-term projects and really staff up their education departments. And so Representative Lenti has sponsored bills in the past several years trying to remedy that and trying to make this change so that that state education funding would go directly to tribes, basically getting rid of that grant process and having that funding go out to tribes automatically instead. And it was something that he was trying to get at last year too. And some of those proposals kind of stalled out, which we can talk a little bit about more later, but yeah, so it's pretty significant that the governor now is saying that she, first of all, wants 50 million, which would be a pretty significant increase in funding, and she wants the way that money goes out to tribes to change.
This is the first time there has been pushback in previous years from the public education department to this idea of ending the grant program. Is that right? I mean, this is the first real buy-in from the administration when it comes to the grant program.
Yeah, I think that's right. Last year, Representative Lentee, and it was something that he, I think, first introduced in 2023, I want to say. There's this proposal to create a tribal education trust fund. And it wouldn't have, so it gets a little technical, but this funding that I was talking about goes out. It's the Indian Education Fund, which was created by the 2003 Indian Education Act. So the idea last year with this trust fund wasn't to get rid of that Indian Education Fund. It was basically that it would be in addition to. We would also have this Tribal Education Trust Fund where this initial investment from the state, it would grow year over year, and tribes could use that interest for tribal education. Yeah, and that there was some opposition about how the distribution formula would work. And so I think the governor actually spoke to this a little bit in her address, that tribal leaders and Native lawmakers have really been working over the past year to come up with a proposal that kind of everyone could get behind. Yeah.
So now she's proposing an additional amount for the Indian Education Fund. It's not that she's not proposing a trust fund. She's just upping the amount of money to go into the fund that was established in 2003. And the majority of that, if I have this right, would go to tribes just automatically based on like a formula, like a per pupil formula. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. And PED is actually working on making a rule change right now to kind of get at that request by the governor. So she's seeking this 50 million for the Indian Education Fund. And at the same time, PED is currently in the process of making a rule change so that instead of this grant process, that 50 million could go directly to tribes and also local education agencies. But yeah, this rule change that PED is working on would see the majority of that money go to tribes.
Bella, am I right too that this new idea that we're talking about in the current kind of grant process, if the tribes do not spend the money after a year or two, some of that money that's unspent, actually we call it revert, it goes back to the state. And in this new kind of like situation, it would stay with the tribes, as I understand it. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's been, something that I think tribal leaders, tribal education officials have raised for years, that this grant process and the fact that the money reverts has really made it impossible to actually build up long-term projects. And it's sort of this like cycle, right, where tribes struggle with capacity in their tribal education departments. But then, and so that makes it hard to spend this funding. And it just, it kind of goes in circles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a
So,
very interesting idea.
Yeah, it is. So there's another bill you're kind of learning about up there that has been proposed by Senator Shindo. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that one, or?
Yeah, that's something that he with other tribal education experts he's been working on for I think several years as well. That bill would allow tribes to enter into agreements with the state to start language and culture-based schools. So the idea is really giving tribes full control over education. And I think it made it through its first committee hearing, I want to say. But I think that really the focus there is, obviously it would, there aren't a whole lot of specifics, I think, so that individual tribes can do what makes sense for them and their communities. But I think the way that Senator Shindo has talked with me about it is that it's really part of the idea is full language immersion, which is something that they've been working on up at Jemez.
And that No, I'm just saying, part of the Yazzie Martinez effort from, in the tribal remedy framework is to really focus on languages, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really big piece of, yeah, of Yazzie Martinez and this tribal remedy framework that was sort of crafted partly in response to those findings.
Bella, do you know if there's any, are there any federal dollars wrapped up with these kind of programs, or did the senator say anything about that?
That's a really good question. I do not have the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't talked with him since kind of all this came down, but yeah, very good question.
Maybe, I mean, Brian, maybe you know some of this stuff. So the Bureau of Indian Education, does that fall under the Interior Department? Or is it's
Yeah.
not,
Yeah, BIA and BIE, right, Bella, are both under the Department of Interior.
okay,
And PED, of course, also has at the state level the Native American Education Office. Although they, as I was mentioning, they have a 25% vacancy rate as well. I had a question, if I may, Bella. You mentioned the tribal remedy framework for the tribe, the way the tribes want to implement the Yazzie ruling. The state also has a responsibility to implement, obviously, and it's been going on 3 years since PED released their discussion draft of their remedy. Have you heard? I know the AG has stepped in and wants to be part of that process and is working with PED on that, but have you heard anything about PED's role? Has their effort progressed over recent years?
They're actually, I think, I want to say maybe in September, the plaintiffs, yeah, filed in court saying that PED has not met its obligations. And I think a big piece of that is, I think you mentioned PED was meant to be crafting this plan basically for how they were going to respond to Yazzie Martinez. And I think there was the kind of draft of that plan 2 or 3 years ago now. And the kind of final version of that plan, as far as I know, was never released. And I think that's a big piece of what this most recent motion from the plaintiffs is partly speaking to. And I think the state was responded in November, I want to say, PED. And so there's yeah, that's kind of, yeah, still going through the courts, but yeah, that's the latest I've heard about that. And I think yeah, I mean, I think you know, the way that Representative Lenti has kind of talked about this most recent development with the governor pushing for 50 million for tribal ed. I think all of that is a massive piece of the tribal remedy framework, is giving more funding and more control to tribes. But yeah, like you said, there obviously school districts have a really big role to play in all of this too. And I think that piece of it is, I think it seems a little bit more unclear right now.
Thank you.
is it, I mean, what's the history here? I mean, why is it important that the tribes get direct, just get the money to control how the money is spent?
I mean, I think we'd have to go like pretty far back to really get into all of that. But I think, I mean, I think the way that yeah, that, you know, everyone I talk with speaks about it is this really goes back to tribes, you know, for centuries have not had full control over the education of their own children. Looking at the history of boarding schools for 150 years. And I think the way that maybe I think maybe it'd be easy to look at, okay, boarding school policy sort of ended in, you know, the late 60s. And I think maybe it's sort of this like, okay, that ended. And so now everything is okay, right? Or like things are better because that policy ended. It's like even after the boarding school policy ended, you know, a lot of Native children went into public schools where, again, tribes have not had control over their education. And we've seen the results of that, you know, really poor education outcomes. And I think, you know, it's been what, 6 years since Yazzie Martinez court ruling, and I think maybe graduation rates have improved slightly, but I think by a lot of, you know, metrics, yeah,
You know,
children are still, yeah, facing poor academic outcomes.
can I jump in here? Because part of what we've done here at New Mexico in Depth is as we were looking at some of the boarding school reports coming out of the Department of Interior during the Biden administration. I think I know I did. I don't know, Bella, if you did, but if you go back and look at the Kennedy report in 1969, which is about Native education, you'll find that there are references to a Miriam report in 1928, where like this is not unknown to certain folks that there's been problems, and that I remember in the Miriam report um, there was some example of how some of the tribes in Oklahoma, uh, more folks who actually, I think it was maybe the Cherokees, I'm not sure about this, they were in control of their own education, and the literacy rate among the Cherokees was higher than around non-native populations. And that was used as a reference to say, hey, they can do this. This was close to 100 years ago. So to the question about like why this is important, if anybody wants some reading to do, the Miriam report and the Kennedy report, and then all these other state reports that we've had over the last 15, 20 years, filed by the LFC, the LESC, Legislative Education Study Committee, and the Legislative Finance Committee, they get at some of these education outcomes.
Sort of like a wealth of information just coming out of like Native academics and
Oh, that's true too. Yeah.
So we have a comment from Laura Harris that she says tribes are governments and a part of the federal system like states. They retain their right to self-governance. And then she also adds, Native students are at the bottom of nearly every socioeconomic indicator. We are the bottom of New Mexico. New Mexico is the bottom of the bottom. Well, yeah, we have a huge challenge on our hands in this state. What Laura's comment and what Bella said bring to mind for me is, we're having this national conversation around Department of Education, and there's this narrative out there at the national level from, that maybe the Department of Education mandates curriculums, and people are like, no, it's state and local control. And I really think what we're talking about here it's similar to that. It's like tribal control, right, of education it would be the same as state and local control, because they are sovereign entities. So that seems to be like kind of maybe the legalistic argument there, for the money going directly to tribes.
Yeah. I mean, this was that open to everybody, Marjorie? You were just commenting. Okay.
Well, I also just want to say I would like to hear a little bit more about the Bureau of Indian Education. I don't really know much about it, and I don't know, Bryant, if you do, what you know about how funding happens through that bureau for tribal education. I mean, not to put you on the spot, you might not have.
It's fine. Bella may know better than me, but there's one trend that's worth noting in this context is that the BIE does have and still run some schools in New Mexico, BIE schools, but they also have started using some of that funding to give the money to the tribes to run their own community schools with money that would otherwise have gone to BIE schools. Some of those schools do have dormitories. They're not considered boarding schools exactly, but the BIE does still care for some of their students 24/7 during the week, at least weekdays. Did I get any of that wrong, Bella? Do you know?
That all sounds right.
Well, we have a comment from April Chavez. April says, first, I recommend reading the Tribal Remedy Framework, wherein tribal scholars and leaders answer this question of why. I agree. I've read it and it is very informative. And Bettina, maybe you could put the link in the chat. It is also on UNM's website. You can Google it, Tribal Remedy Framework. And then April says, BIE runs over 183 schools across 26 states. They operate tribally run schools and agency operated schools.
If I wanted to mention that there's also now a book out edited by UNM professor Wendy Gray Eyes on the Yazzie case in particular. That's worth taking a look at.
Oh, what's the name, Bryant?
It's, I think this is going to show up backwards on my screen, but it's the Yazzie case, building a public education system for our indigenous future.
Can you possibly share that link?
Yep.
The chat for all of us. Suddenly my ears perked up. You said book, and because that's we all know and appreciate Wendy Gray Eyes and the work that she and other scholars do here in the state. Okay, I'm gonna probably pick that up because this is interesting, just to get up my bearings on some of these questions. And this stuff can get, when you talk about education policy and funding and all this kind of stuff, it can get really complicated. And I'm going to introduce a topic that you guys all may say, Trip, that is like way out there and we don't need to talk about it. But in the past 10 years, we've had a lot of discussions about impact aid, and how they have helped fund districts. Impact aid is basically, money that comes from the feds when there's property maybe somewhere in a town or that they can't tax, and it is like an ability for some of these local entities to get money that they otherwise couldn't get because of these properties that aren't necessarily on the tax base. And at one point, Gallup McKinley was heavily reliant on it. The district was heavily reliant on impact aid. Is there does anybody know maybe if impact aid is going to be affected by some of this stuff coming down from Washington? I know that's a really obscure question, but maybe not. Okay. All right.
Well, I mean, I think what you're asking, Trip, gets at the myriad ways that federal dollars trickle down to local communities. There's so many threads, right?
So many. Yes.
And then, there's a special obligation to make sure that the federal government funds a variety of things that they owe. They're in treaties with tribal nations. So there's particularly things around impact aid, is like, well, if there's a ton of federal land and your property base is impacted, that's where it comes from. And it's a federal thing. It's not like just a federal New Mexico thing.
No, that's federal. That's right. Every state. That's right.
So this flurry of activity in DC has got everyone just kind of like, it's hard to digest what all could be affected, knowing that they are just doing things really quickly, like, hey, federal employees, just resign. Hey, we're going to just stop, we're going to put a stop on sending out money to these programs. It's just this announcement, and it just kind of happens. And there's so many different programs and so many different funding streams that it's almost like it's this overwhelming thing. And by design, and I think is probably by design. So there's so many things to find out there. And that's a really great question that you ask, that we should put on our list.
Well, I mean, what is the list now? Is it up to like 100 questions? No, I'm joking. Attendees. We don't have that many, but there might be.
I'm sure we could.
And we should probably note that, we've been here before on impact funding as well. In 2020, at the end of his term, Trump tried to get Congress to eliminate impact funding and was not successful. So this is money that the feds, when there's federal land around a school district or within a school district that otherwise would be privately owned and taxed for school funding, the feds step in and give some of this impact funding to schools, right?
I mean, that's the thing about, and we're just talking about education now. That's it. I mean, when you expand it to all of government and how federal dollars move through, because state governments are pass-throughs for a lot of federal dollars, and how it would affect everything from Head Start offices to free lunches, reduced lunches, whatever. And also, this is something that I want to say because I've covered state budgets for so long, and I've gotten out of the practice of doing this. We often talk about the state budget and we say it's, like right now, the governor's proposal and the Legislative Finance Committee's proposal, they're within, a few hundred million, maybe 100 million of each other, around $10.9 billion. People need to remember that that's just the state's share of the budget. The actual budget is much higher. If you look at the budget, it's more like 28 billion because there's a lot of federal money moving through. And that's something that every state is looking at right now. So
Right. I mean, yeah, for New Mexico, for real, it's the Medicaid dollars are massive.
yeah. It's last week, Marjorie, when we were doing that story, I looked at the last 10 state budgets, and federal dollars are, it's like 40% of the state budget when you look at all the stuff. So anyway,
So, Nordy Kalishman, hi Nordy.
hi, Morty.
Says if Kara Bobroff is on this Zoom, I'd be interested in hearing her perspective on developing Native schools. She was the founder of NACA, Native American Charter Academy. Nordy, I believe she was on the Zoom, but it looks like she's no longer on the list. But yes, that would be super interesting, and maybe
Yes, agreed.
maybe I mean, there's just there's so many questions.
I mean, her model has spread nationwide. There are NACA schools in Oklahoma, I think, as I recall. So yeah, that's a great question, Nordy.
All right. So anyone on the Zoom, final comments or questions? We'll probably wrap up here. Any concluding thoughts, Bella, Bryant, Tripp?
Our to-do list just got longer.
Yeah, it's longer, but I would expect that. And
Yeah.
so the session we're in our third week.
Beginning, so Monday would have been the second week. So yeah, third week. Yeah.
We're in our
Right.
third week, and so we mentioned some tribal education bills that we're following, that Bella's following in particular. We'll obviously be paying attention to all of these developments at the session as it heats up. It's beginning to heat up. We're beginning to see some bills that we're interested in following, moving through. Last week we talked about campaign finance and like other kind of elections-oriented bills. Some of those are beginning to move. So just stay posted. We'll be following these issues. And Tripp, did you?
One comment. We have one comment from Laura Harris. Kara
Okay.
and One Generation, have been working with APS, Albuquerque Public Schools, regarding urban Native students. Report soon to be out.
Great.
Thank you, Laura, for that. That's something we will be paying attention to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This is the thing about these calls is that these interactions, the conversations, the questions, stuff like that, sometimes give us nuggets to follow.
I'm gonna write that down right now.
Yeah.
Great. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. We appreciate you taking an hour out of your day with us, and we'll be back next week. So tune in.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. See you.